So I think we are online. So first of all, very warm welcome to our webinar today, Make Sustainability Actionable in Sourcing. Very exciting webinar. My name is Tanja Reilly. I'm from EcoVadis, and I'm super happy to moderate this session for the next hour together with you. Before we start, just a few organizational things. The webinar will be recorded, and of course you will get everything later on. So you can relax and enjoy the session. And during the session, you also can add questions because I'm pretty sure there will be a few questions coming up. And so at the end of the day, we have reserved 10 minutes for Q&A session with our experts. But now let's come to our topic for today. Sustainability becomes more and more, I think, a strategic and important topic for organizations. But what I saw the last years, also during my own experience, is that it's not easy getting started, especially when you look at procurement organizations. This is why we put a spotlight today on making sustainability actionable in sourcing today. And I'm super happy. We have great speakers with a diverse panel today, bringing different perspectives and voices respected to their field of research, cooperation from the doers, and of course, so enablers. So what we will do, we will break down sustainability, and is a big word, a little bit down into different components before we discuss to make it actionable for the organizations. So, and lastly, our panelists will share some ideas. I think this is super important, how you can really get started in your company and on that journey. So, but let's start with a short introduction of each panelist we have today here. And maybe you can also give us your view on sustainability. Why does it matter for you? And why should it matter for procurement? And I would say, ladies first. Clara, maybe you want to start with the introduction?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm Clara Rowe. It's great to be with all of you here today. I am the CEO of Restore, a new organization based in Zurich. I'm coming from Mexico City and the US before that. So it's really terrific to be in a new home thinking about sustainability with all of you. So I guess I get to start with a little bit of a philosophical reflection on what sustainability means to me before we dig into the actionable part of things. And you know, the UN, and I think this was in the introduction to the meeting, provides this very simple definition of what sustainability means: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And, you know, it's simple, it's elegant, and I think it's important to give us collective clarity and purpose as we think about the future of our planet and the future of all of us who are on it. But it's not a roadmap. And as sustainability becomes this increasingly hot topic, it's also increasingly thrown around in vague ways that make us feel good. You know, that sustainable sweatshirt that I purchased, or the sustainable cheese I put in my sandwich this morning. And unfortunately, in this way, sustainability has become something of an empty word as well, when it really should be an invitation to be able to dig into complexity of planning for, you know, what it means to have a thriving today and a thriving future simultaneously. I really shouldn't be satisfied with a sustainable sweatshirt. You know, I should want to know, where are the factory workers from? How much are they paid? Where was the cotton grown? Did it contribute to deforestation or maybe conversion of native grasslands? Were pesticides applied? And if they were, did agricultural workers have proper protective equipment? I'll stop myself from going down this rabbit hole about my new sweatshirt, but instead I do want to offer kind of a few big picture ways that I think about embracing the complexity of sustainability. One is accepting that there's no fixed end where the world suddenly becomes sustainable. So the details of sustainability for 5 billion people, you know, what we can and what we should eat, how we can and how we should travel, doesn't look the same for sustainability for 5 billion people or 15 billion people. And also sustainability for today's global GDP per capita isn't the same as sustainability for a richer world. So it's this moving target, which doesn't give us permission to avoid getting specific, but it's important that we think about how to adapt our planning. And it can be daunting, but I will bet, based on this audience and many procurement professionals here, that it's not an unfamiliar place to be, that moving target. And the second way I think about embracing this complexity is recognizing that while there are real planetary limits and tipping points when we're thinking about carbon, biodiversity, water availability, et cetera, I found that it can be counterproductive to think of sustainability as this purely objective concept. So I think in order to set meaningful goals and targets at any level, you really have to consult and co-create. And this means bringing in perspectives from local and indigenous communities, civil society advocacy groups, local governments, scientists, and it means being able to go back and forth in a respectful way between local interventions and global ones. So I think the bottom line for me is we have to treat our definition of sustainability as a living document.
Great, thank you. That was a very good overview of your thoughts about that. Maybe Thomas, you want to go next with an introduction and what does it mean for you? And
yeah, so thanks. I mean, it's difficult to follow that one, Clara. I mean, I think you've sort of set the scene here, and I, wholeheartedly agree with everything. And a big thanks. I see we have 160 participants now, so it's really nice to see there's so much interest. So I'm Tanja Udesen. I'm the CPO at Bayer, and also the co-founder of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. I guess to the question, why do I think this topic is important, and what's my personal link with that? And that's really been through the fact that I'm a practitioner. I've been out and about. I've worked in Africa, in Indonesia and Asia, in the rainforest. I mean, I've seen impact of doing it the right way. I've seen what is possible, but I've also seen what can happen if you don't do it well. The sort of trade-off between economic progress and civil objectives, a wish for also having a social growth for individuals who come in very privileged societies. So it's always followed me through my professional life. I've also had the benefit of working for some organizations that absolutely get it and who is also prepared to do something about it. So over the years, whether it was with Johnson & Johnson, in my past role, in the whole topic of, let's say, sustainable palm oil, or more recently in Bayer, where very much looking at how do we also make our supply chain more responsible, but not as an individual company, but as part of industry collaboration. So that whole theme of collaboration has just followed me throughout my career. And just 18 months ago or so, we were very much inspired by the global climate strike, where everybody, kids, adults, people from all walks of life, went out to the streets and reminded us of exactly the biggest responsibility, and that is to make sure that the next generations can have a life that is just as good as what we've had, and that necessitates changes. And that's where we and here as procurement professional, we're really sitting with finger on the pulse. Our decisions every day decide whether we will reach the UN SDGs or not. And many of you have confined with us that current practices are by no means good enough. And if we continue on the current path, we have a problem. We are not going to meet our SDGs, and bad things are going to happen. So we are part of the solution, and I call on everybody to don't treat procurement as a job, but treat it as a responsibility.
And to be honest, I think procurement can be the game changer in this role. So I think they are playing a super important role here. But yes, and Stefan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah,
introduce
sure.
yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Stefan Wagner. I'm a professor of supply chain management at ETH Zürich. I've always, the question, why is the topic important? Of course, when you think about supply chain, you immediately think about optimization. You look for efficiency improvements. We have something in research which we call the competitive priorities of operations, competitive priorities of purchasing, which we have researched and optimized. They've always started with cost, time, availability, technology, innovation. And lately is the last 20 years, sustainability has been added. So it's kind of a natural further development for us also to think about sustainability when we talk about supply chain optimization. We cannot leave that out anymore. And I'm strongly convinced about that. And even further, and Clara has touched upon this, we've started out a lot with this environmental aspects. Now we talk about ESG risks, environmental, social, and governance. And we try to bring this in, and that's what excites me. In the next step, and Thomas pointed out to this, from a research perspective, we need to generate impact and more on society, not only on companies. That's why these sustainable development goals are asked for by our president at ETH. He would ask, how do you contribute to the achievement of the sustainable development goals? And that's why we have to include sustainability in our work, let me put it this way. And I do supply chain, logistics, but a lot of procurement work. And why procurement? I mean, the simple equation is always companies outsource a large portion of what they give to their customers. If they want to have impact, they need to look at their suppliers, because that's where sustainability occurs, or where the harm occurs. Traditionally, we have looked at cost. We only influence a small portion of the cost in the company, and the majority at the supply chain. So we need to optimize the supply chain. And that's the same with sustainability. So this high degree of outsourcing is a major driver for having to include sustainability in our discussions. You all know about the scope 3 emissions. That's what happens in the supply chain. And then last comment, what drives me is one, impact on society, already mentioned, the need of the customers. Clara mentioned the t-shirt. Then the regulators, they ask us to do something. I call it the supply chain law. How does that influence what we do in procurement? How does it influence how we set up our supply chains? So Konzernverantwortungsinitiative, we need to do something about it. There's no option anymore. And the last stakeholder group, so to say, where I'm personally very much interested in what drives that sustainability a lot is investors, pension funds. They want sustainable investments. And if we do not turn our companies around into sustainable companies, the companies will be off the capital market. And this is a major driver, and that I'm excited about this, and drives me to look into this topic from a research perspective, and also, of course, working with organizations.
Yeah, so
okay,
thank you. That was great input. And one interesting point here is that you mentioned the finance sector, and the French Ministry of Economy. She said during a conference 2 or 3 weeks ago, guys, you need to look at sustainability. You need to wake up. You need to move forward, because you can have the best ideas in the future, but there will be no one who will be investing and finance that. So I think you really make a very, very hot topic that we really need to take care about that and think out of the box. Not, oh, wow, there's Konzerninitiative or there's a law. We really need to make it a little bit more broader. But Lucas, I don't want to leave you behind. You're the last one, and happy to get your thoughts.
A lot of pressure on me now, but welcome everyone. I'm very happy that so many people made it. I'm Lucas. I'm one of the co-founders of Archlet. I'm also located in Zurich, and I actually have some relations with Stefan Wagner, because he was my professor back in the days when I studied at ETH Zurich. And I have quite a personal story why sustainability matters for me. And actually, we started the company 2018, and we supported, our first tender was in a resins area. So a company came to us and they said, we have to buy resins. So resins go into plastic products like packaging, PET, etc. And they had this huge complexity because they weren't able to manage discounts and rebates. And we've built this prototype of an algorithm. And then I went home one night and I told my roommate, wow, we made it, it's working, and we can now help them to buy resins. And he would look at me like, wait, you're buying something which is going to be plastic afterwards? Don't you feel guilty, Lucas? And I stopped quickly and I was like, wait a moment. I never had the intention to do something bad. I told him what we did, and I was kind of an evil in his eyes, right? And that made me speechless, of course. And I had no answer to that. Honestly, I was like, you're right, we help them to buy plastics more efficiently, better, cheaper, etc. But then we had a lot of discussions with our founders, and we realized actually it's not a bad thing, it's a big chance, because we are, of course, as you've mentioned, all of you three, procurement is a competence center, and it's not just taking the cheapest and we solve the problem with the discounts. But what if we start including additional parameters such as sustainability factors, such as non-cost drivers, and help them to make more sustainable decisions? And that's why suddenly it turned out to be an intrinsic motivation, because we realized even though we're students, we can impact their strategies. And because sourcing is the first thing of a company strategy often, we have actually quite a big impact in doing so. So I think for me, it changed then from kind of helping to shaping companies to make them be more sustainable. And that made me, of course, sleep more quietly during nights. And my best friend didn't neglect me. And I think he now understands us even more and supports us, because he thinks that's actually quite a change we made in our thinking and approaching the topic.
Great. So thank you. That was, I would say, a very, very good start. And I'm super happy to see how engaged everyone is from different perspectives, because we need a lot of people to make it happen. But now we really put sustainability in the spotlight. Let's break it down a bit and have a look what we are actually talking about. So sustainability is more an umbrella term, I would say, and it's not easy to understandable for a lot of units within organization. I also found out, so there are different meanings, different understandings, and I've noticed that in purchasing departments, very often they find it difficult to implement and launch sustainability. So maybe let's get started by defining it a little bit more concreter now. And Stefan, I want to start with you from your research perspective. So my question is more, what role does sustainability play in supplier relation management and procurement research functions, and how has it evolved? Because you're doing a lot of research, you told us, for decades. So how has that topic evolved over the last years? That would be interesting to understand.
Yeah. Well, first, I think the research evolves with practice. So we as researchers, we are supposed, not everybody's doing this, but we are supposed to look into practice, what happens there, how can we support with analytical and research methods to improve this. And as a consequence, if I would look at the literature, no worries, I'm not going to provide a lit review here, but starting like in the 90s, in procurement, supply chain, it was all about more the green issues. At that time, we still called it green supply chain, green procurement. So it was more the environmental impact. This has then been expanded, like in, I would say, 2005. The concept of the triple bottom line was quite prominent in research, saying we need to the social, environmental, and economic impact. So one does not come without the other. There was still the discussion on, companies only go green if they benefit. So if there is a financial benefit with this, and this has all been reflected in the research that has been done, and it's quite intensive. So there was a lot of, or there's still a lot of research in this area. Just what we also did lately was relating sustainability to financial performance, relating sustainability to shareholder value, for example. So this brings me back to my investors. Why should investors be interested? And we did, I think, a very nice study published in 2019 that shows that supplier sustainability risk. So if a company experiences a supplier sustainability risk that they have to announce, share price goes down. So on average, 1%. This might sound not very much, but if you look at other risks, that's quite substantial. So 1% share price reduction. If a company announces we have a problem with a supplier in Bangladesh because there are labor issues, this brings the share price down. So these studies are very important, because this is what the CFO is interested in, what the shareholders are interested in, to demonstrate, yes, sustainability issues really have financial implications. It's not just kind of indirect arguing, well, the customers then more likely buy our products and we might make more turnover as a consequence. That's a little the soft things. So what I'm saying, research has moved, empirical research, I must say, has moved into linking this to financial performance. And then kind of the next step in this development is going beyond first tier. I mean, what Lucas talked about is supplier selection using sustainability criteria, but we all know that these sustainability issues occur further upstream. And this is what research is currently trying to include to better study, also data-wise. So what happens if there's a sustainability misconduct in third tier, fourth tier, somewhere? How does that influence? We call this spillovers. So how do these spillovers materialize? Legitimacy spillovers. We have a study doing this. So how does this lack of legitimacy using child labor at a third tier supplier, why does that spill over? What is the influence of the other stakeholders? What is the influence of the media in this whole relationship in the model, so that the buying firm is responsible? And then we study when do stakeholders hold the buying firm accountable? So one, for example, and I cannot elaborate in detail, is can the buying firm actually influence what happens? One. Second, do they have visibility? Should they have known? Do they know? And then, of course, these mechanisms have a larger impact. So this is one. And this brings me to the last research development. How do companies create visibility? So how should a buyer know what happens at third tier? Because they don't even know who the supplier is. They might not know who the supplier is. So how do they, we have used the term extending the visibility boundary. I know who the first tier supplier is, I can control this, I might have an audit, but what happens further upstream? And we have kind of developed then tools or mechanisms how these suppliers can be identified. And this goes a little bit in the direction that I should discuss later on, using some proxies to identify where are the critical spots. And then last comment, this whole supply chain and sourcing sustainability issues has a lot to do with the research, the established research on supply chain risk. They have the same problem. So not sustainability wise, but there's a disruption somewhere in Asia, impact on the supply chains. Also the same question, how should I know? How should I have known? How do I get informed if something happens? So that's why, and then last thing, we call this supply chain sustainability risk, actually. That's a risk perspective that we take more. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of the developments, and again saying that it's broader. We study governance issue, we study corruption, we study process-related risks like sweatshops and child labor, as we do environmental aspects. And that's quite advanced, I want to say. Okay, great, so that gives you a little bit input into this discussion.
Yeah, very interesting input, and I think also interesting for the audience. I think you, together with Archlet, created a white paper, a study, and everyone, I think, should read that. I did that 2 days ago, and it's always helpful to get these insights of your really valuable research work and use it for my own business. So, Thomas, coming to you. You, if I may say, for me, you're one of the early adopters of sustainability in procurement. And what is your experience in corporate procurement, and how do people define sustainability there? Because I think it's a big difference, and I really want to learn a bit more about that.
I don't think it has to be that different, because I think what Stefan has been able to articulate incredibly well, and also, get as insights from practices is, reflecting some of the practices out there. I think there are very mature organizations that have adopted some of those practices, who have created proxies for what happens in tier 2, tier 3, who have, also that sense of responsibility despite the enormous complexity that happens. The sad thing is that's a relatively small percentage of companies who have made that investment, who have taken the time to actually understand that. The vast majority, 80% plus, are far away from that scenario that we should be operating according to. But let's maybe go back to the question. So what is it that is the definition? I think very much as Stefan says, it started with a lot of environmental concerns. What's the spillage? What are the practices at the factories? Over time, the social dimension also came in. How do you make sure that companies help to reduce inequality, that the working conditions are appropriate, that the safety is well considered? So it's really moving towards this people, planet, and profit, because as part of a capitalist system, also we also need to, of course, make sure that there is a return and that the companies are capable of investing and that the investors are also getting a fair return. So there is also a need for companies to have a financial return. So it is people, planet, and profit. And we see that that's really where most of the organizations are gravitating towards. Also, thankfully, we see that there's a convergence around the SDGs. Most organizations are now articulating their plans along the 17 principles, and some of them are even capable of coming up with credible impact measures that they're also publicly reporting and making themselves accountable towards. We see a lot of organizations also now particularly linked with initiatives like the Science-Based Target Initiative that really go out with sort of a 10-year roadmap that says we will go with bold commitments, be it on CO2 or it could be other dimensions, that we make ourselves accountable. And even some companies, including Bayer, make everybody's bonus depending on whether you are actually following up on this. So everybody's from the CEO to everybody is dependent on whether we as a company are delivering on the promises that we have made. So there is a continuum of maturity happening, and I think what Stefan mentioned is that's the practice that we need to get everybody towards. I think there are probably even many people on the line here who says yes, but that's not what I'm doing. And that's the kind of conversation that we need to have. How do we equip everybody to build the courage to start having those conversations? How do we give them the tools in their hands so that they can start the conversations? How do we make sure leaders make it a priority? That's a sort of conversation that we are also trying to push when it comes to the sustainable procurement pledge, because we definitely can fix this, but it requires action and it requires leadership.
Yes, absolutely. As I already mentioned, the research work you did on that topic, would love to hear what has surprised you most about the research you supported, Lucas.
Yes, I think it's building up on Thomas' point, because what surprised me when we did this master thesis with ETH Zürich, and we figured out that there's almost no literature or much less literature available if it's about sourcing decisions, while the supplier evaluation part, which is kind of the first step in the source to contract, where you evaluate suppliers, you audit them, maybe give them a ranking. This is very developed, and you have companies like EcoVadis, but you have also other auditors which provide information, and you have a lot of research. And then I always pushed the student we want to know, how do you embed these data points into sourcing decisions? Because as soon suppliers reach this barrier of, yes, they are sustainable, they're allowed to quote, then suddenly everything is on price again, or basically they're all in the same pot. And I think this surprised me, but it also, of course, confirmed our hypothesis that when it's about the actionable sourcing decision, often even data is missing, or there are wrong incentives of buyers because nobody tells them to focus on sustainability criteria, risk criteria, diversity scores, etc. So I think this gap was definitely we felt this gap in this project, and it's kind of also nice that there is still a gap because we can work on it. But of course, that we have to do something, and I guess that's in the end my biggest surprise and takeaway from the study so far.
That is quite interesting, because when I speak to suppliers who have for example, EcoVadis rating and are very good in CSR performance, and when it comes to RFPs, very often they say, you know, Tanja, and it's so disappointing because we are really engaged to drive sustainability. And at the end of the day, who gets the RFP, or who won the RFP? The biggest, the cheapest one. And maybe they are less mature in sustainability. And I think this is also creating demotivation on supplier side moving forward with that topic. So you're completely right. I think this is a topic where we really need to work on together. But I think all your summaries, that's a great transition into our next topics. So as you said, a lot of companies struggle to include sustainability in their decision making. I think that's a fact. So let's talk about what companies can do to include sustainability into their activities, and how they really can make sustainability actionable, because this is where we really need to move forward. And starting with you, Clara, maybe. You have designed and implemented sustainability sourcing programs for many, many companies. So you have a lot of different views, and you also have seen how sustainability teams are sometimes disconnected from sourcing teams. And my question to you is, what do you think companies should focus on to make their sustainability sourcing program successful? And what is your suggestion to sustainability teams to make sure that sourcing teams cooperate in a pragmatic way within a company to make it happen?
Absolutely. No, thank you very much. And, before my current role, I spent a lot of time with many different companies, especially in the commodity space, thinking about this. And so I've tried to kind of boil down the things that I saw over and over again that we're struggling with on the procurement side and the sustainability side. And really, they were two sides of the same coin as they were thinking about how to make this happen. And so as I've thought about it, I've boiled it down to a few different points. One is around prioritizing. So there's lots of methodologies out there to do it. There's materiality assessments, there's human rights assessments. You can go through the gamut. And the key point really is start somewhere. Start where you have the most impact, where you can make the most change. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be working towards sustainability across, materials, but it is important to start somewhere. Integration is something that I saw many companies struggle with. So sustainable sourcing obviously can't be the responsibility of a single area or department. And I think the no-brainer is sort of integrating goals and information streams between procurement and sustainability teams. So I watched many sustainability teams collect lots of detailed information about suppliers. They might pass it to the procurement team, but there was no system for the procurement team integrating that into the other metrics that they had to choose between suppliers. And so that information just sort of sat there on a desk. But I've also seen a lot of lack of integration between global and regional teams, maybe procurement teams and R&D. So you also have to think kind of beyond the traditional sustainable team and sustainability team and procurement team. And the one specific case that comes to mind for me is a company that had a commitment to responsible sourcing of palm oil, pretty standard these days. And their procurement department made the decision to suspend a supplier because of a series of high-profile grievances that were associated with the operations. And they communicated this to external stakeholders, the NGOs complaining about the supplier, but they never communicated it internally. And so when R&D found out, they had to tell procurement that it would take 10 months to be able to test an alternative agreement. And so just at that very basic level, having that across the board integrated is really, really important. I said it in my intro, but I wanted to reiterate this idea of co-creation. So target setting and implementation plans that do include stakeholder input and participation. Often that can be something that the sustainability department works with, but obviously that has to be translated into the way that procurement is working. And I think it's important to say you don't have to reinvent the wheel on this a lot of the time. So there's lots of internationally recognized standards that exist for no deforestation, for example, that have already been created in consultation. So it's not to say you must do it every time. It's just to say, look for the space where that has happened. And I guess the last thing is be bold. So I've watched a lot of companies watch other companies and, wait to see what path they should follow, wait for large industry associations to set a standard for them. And, I do urge procurement teams to watch, learn from your peers, but don't let the lack of a perfect solution stop you. You can't wait for perfect alignment, because otherwise you'll never get there.
Absolutely. This is normally a German culture. We want to have everything in a perfect shape before we start. But I always say, step out of your silos, get together, finance, HR, procurement. We need to work all on that topic and not fight in silos. So absolutely, this is what I see as well on a daily basis. So yes, but now come to Stefan. You have supported the master thesis and research study at ETH Zurich on what sustainability metrics would be relevant to organizations on a category level. And what are key metrics identified during the study, and what are the challenges you have uncovered? So how can companies make use of this information?
I'll answer this question in just a second. Let me give one comment on what Clara said. I fully agree. We wrote 2017 a paper which is called Extending the Visibility Boundary. And there kind of the 3 steps are supply chain analysis. Where should we look? So for which commodity do we have a problem? A company that buys electricity could be an issue, and the same company buys plastic raisins. So which parts of the supply chain should we look at? And then second step is stakeholder analysis. Who are the stakeholders around electricity? Who are the stakeholders around plastic resin? And third step is then, what are the issues of these stakeholders? What are they concerned about? So these 3 steps are exactly what Clara said. We shouldn't wait and go through these 3 steps and do this. Now, this already leads over to your question concerning the categories. First comment is, sustainability very much depends on the category. And what we've seen in the study, we just had 4 sample categories looking into, from raw material, packaging, transportation services. And of course, the sustainability ESG issues are different depending on what you look at. And then I think the major challenge is to find proxies. And then you have 2 types of proxies. One is more a company internal one. So if you look into transportation as an example, you could look at the company's supply chain network, transportation network that they use. But then you somehow need to generate that company internal information to attach it to a sourcing decision of transportation services. Or you have proxies that are more general country proxies, corruption indices, child labor indices on a country level or on an industry level. But these are, I think, good points to start out with, because it's an illusion to wait and to try to figure out what is the best, not even a proxy, but what is really measuring environmental impact in transportation. So kilometers traveled could be one. So this is a distance is a proxy for kilometers traveled. And from there, if you know which mode of transportation is used, you can derive CO2 impact. It's an estimate, but it's a good estimate. And that's what we did in this study, or what the student also did in this study, go through all these, the 4 categories that we looked at, and figure out what are potential proxies to measure impact. And then the question, which of these proxies are relevant? You know, there we did a study and asked over 100 people, is it a good proxy? Is it relevant? Yes or no? This goes a little bit more into kind of a perceptual, we call this a perceptual measure, which is not as good as really knowing how much CO2 is emitted. That would be ideal. But if we wait until we have this, we wouldn't start from the beginning. And with the proxy, in the end, if we capture 60, 70, 80% of the potential impact, that's already good enough for improving the sourcing decision substantially. So this is what the study went through, and again, only for some samples, but I think it's a good start, and the methodology kind of also worked.
Great. Yeah, and really, again, I encourage everyone to read this study. It gives you very good insights. So Thomas, I know this is a topic of your heart, and you have founded also the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. By the way, a great initiative. I really love it, and it's great to see that it's growing so fast. But at the same time, you're the CPO of a large organization. So do these findings align in what you see in the corporate world, what Stefan mentioned, and what metrics should people focus on from your own experience and discussion with your peers, because of course you are connected to them? And what are the challenges, and I think this is also in my interest, keep them from going further? So it would be great to hear a little bit more insights on that.
Yeah, I think the notion that perfection is the enemy of progress or good is valid here. So I think if you are going for the sort of 5-star scenario and you are having a very low maturity, chances are that you are going to be paralyzed and no progress will be seen. So I think that's sort of important, that there's a bit of humility and acceptance of where is that starting point. And I think what many organizations will do is they will start maybe measuring, maybe rudimental, but what is my scale? How many audits? What's the percentage of my spend? What type of conversations do I have? Have I managed to include it in my supplier review? So a bit of an activity perspective, and that may be very good to start, to also see that you're actually doing more and more. But what of course really matters is impact, and what impact do you have? So there has to be an evolution of those KPIs. And then I think, as Stefan is saying, particularly when it comes to the CO2 footprint, and again, many companies are now on some degree of path towards net zero. And reality is that with the complexity that exists, you will have to work with proxies, and for many organizations, accepting that a proxy is the best you can get right now, and that's good enough to get going. But then of course, as you move forward, you can also get a bit more advanced, and I think the world is anyhow coming together in terms of getting more clarity around the methodologies. Now, how do you become more advanced in measuring topics like CO2? So I think it's accepting that it is a journey that's very, very critical.
Yes, absolutely. And then this is what we see also on a daily basis. And you mentioned CO2 reduction, and it's sometimes, of course, interesting to see these days that you have a strategic approval from the board, which say by 2030 we are carbon neutral. But very often procurement teams come back to me and say, okay, but how do we get there? Scope 1, Scope 2, we have visibility, but looking at Scope 3, our own supply chain, we don't have any visibility. So this is also, I think, a big challenge these days. So, but now coming to you, Lucas, you founded Archlet because you found that companies struggle to manage their data, which is, I think, true, especially in complex sourcing decisions, because you have many data here. So my question to you is more, how can technology empower organization to go further when it comes to incorporating sustainability into their award decisions, and what kind of metrics you encounter when companies want to use sustainability in sourcing, and what are the challenges people are facing with that? I think it's interesting to understand.
Yeah, I think we see technology here as an enabler to basically manage trade-off between cost and other factors. And what we often hear from buyers is that they say, well, I have this huge Excel file and I have only limited amount of time, and the easiest for me is to focus on price, because this is also where my bonus is coming from. But then actually what technology can help is asking the question, how much does it cost me more if I have a sustainable scenario? And we like to use this scenario term. I know sometimes it's confusing, but it's kind of a strategy. So how much does it cost me more to be more sustainable? This is a question, it's very hard to answer, because in the end, you have your data points and how to put them in a strategy, and then argue internally, if we switch from this supplier to the other, we may pay more, but we can increase our sustainability by X because they have a higher EcoVadis rating, or because we have some other category relevant parameters we measured. So it's about kind of, yeah, forcing that conversation internally, but then also externally, and also telling suppliers, guys, if you want to win this lot or this category of these SKUs, you have to increase that and that, or commit us to work on that and these points. And I think this is all about kind of, yeah, becoming more aware and help buyers to also make it more actionable in terms of trying to incorporate it into your communications with your bosses and internal stakeholders. And I give you a specific example. Or as Stefan said, as Thomas said, it's very category specific. So that's also what we try to do. One example is in the area of packaging, where you can ask your suppliers, you have your current weights, and you ask them, can you provide us an innovative method to reduce the weight? And then Clara, it's about collaboration again. And in the end, you have two options. Either you go with the same weight, or you reduce the weight, but you maybe have higher production costs. And in the end, it's then again a scenario where you say, well, this is my current stage. This is how I pay at the moment. This is the amount of material I use. I could go lower weight. I may reduce the material. I have probably higher production costs, and this would be the trade-off. So, and then this visualizing and make it kind of appealing that your managers maybe say, well, if it's like this and we only pay this amount more, and then we turn around the raw material savings into CO2 savings, that actually helps us to achieve our goals. And I think here it's very, very interesting how technology can be an enabler. Of course, it doesn't work for all categories like this. I would say like services, like consulting services, it's much harder to have these quantitative factors, but their scores from companies like EcoVadis could of course help. And Stefan, what I wanted to mention also regarding the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, for example, what we always kind of propose to our buyers is now include and ask them, where do they get the material from? Because you can simply ask them in the bidding sheet, right? And ask them, where is your contingency supplier, or where is actually this material coming from? And then you at least start collecting the data. What you do with it, maybe we are not the best ones to help you with it, but at least you start collecting and increase awareness of these tier 2 suppliers, which can be also part of an RFQ.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think technology is super important because we have so many data flowing around, and it's hard to bring them into a good shape that we can make good decisions. So I think, as you said, technology is an enabler. So that was super interesting from a summarized perspective. But what I have heard is we are in a bit of a pickle. So on one hand, people are aware that sustainability is super important, and they understand the benefits of integrating that into their decision. But they are also facing challenges from gathering information and integrating into their processes. So now it would be super interesting to come to the heart, and what are your recommendations how to get started on that journey in procurement? Because we talked a lot about detailed things, but how we really can make it actionable now, to come back to the point. So Thomas, let's start with you. What is your advice for individuals, like persons or organization, to get started with sustainability? I guess people shouldn't wait for their organization, or should they?
No, they shouldn't. I think that's where, of course, the pledge is you can start from within. So I think there's a personal commitment. Again, it's a responsibility. So if your bosses doesn't get it yet, then at least you should start, and then, work your way through, build knowledge, curriculum, and help to educate them and win them over. But I guess my advice is, it is an enormous topic, but don't get intimidated by the size of the challenge that we have. Start, and maybe start small, learn quick, scale up, and don't feel alone, because there's a lot of people who is nervous. We know there is a confidence gap here also in our procurement community. There are many people who want to share practices, and many people have fallen on their nose, and and you made a few mistakes, but that's what makes you stronger. So, keep going, get up, talk to other peers, join the pledge, talk to your ambassadors. We are, by now 3,800 ambassadors from 142 countries. We are here to help, right? So, just get going. It's a responsibility.
Yes, join this initiative. I really love it. But we have a lot of questions, so maybe we short this part a bit. So what are the areas, Stefan, you think from a research perspective are already advanced enough to tackle now?
I think it links to what I said earlier, and I can make this brief. We still need to establish the link to financial performance, because the argument is still often, how do we really benefit? Is in the financial performance could be cost down, could be life cycle cost, could be shareholder value, and this is something we need to do research on to better understand what are we call it the boundary condition. What drives it that the costs go down? What drives it that the company is more attractive if sustainability increases? Just that's more an observation. If you look at annual reports of companies, years ago, they started reporting about supply chains. They never did before. Supply chain risk, like a 2-pager on supply chains, and now they report on sustainability issues. And from a research perspective, that's very interesting for us, this mechanism between the finance sector, profitability impact, sustainable practices, and how this kind of interlinks in the end, driving the topic and driving the implementation and the scaling up of the initiatives in the companies. So that's kind of research-wise what's tremendously interesting.
And Clara, you're in the sustainability community. So where do they go? How do you partner with organizations to get them started?
Yeah, so I want to echo what Thomas said a bit, which is that there's a huge amount of opportunity in terms of seeking help. So depending where you are, there's lots of NGOs in the sustainability world, consulting companies in the sustainability world that will support you. So they will support you to map your supply chains if that's where you are. They will support you to work on specific commodities if you already know where it is that you want to focus. And so ask for help, work with those that have the expertise to be able to do that. And the organization that I work in now, Restore, means I've moved a little bit away from the role of directly supporting companies in the sustainable sourcing journey. But instead, we now provide this huge wealth of data, actually, that can facilitate a range of decisions and actions. So our name kind of says it, Restore. We work on restoration, and restoration in a really broad sense of the word, which I think is important to think about from a sustainable sourcing perspective, because it includes sustainable agriculture, agroforestry, restoration of wetlands, peatlands, grasslands, yes, tree planting as well. And so we are hosting the best available global science and satellite imagery on this platform. Even pre-launch, we've attracted more than 20,000 projects around the world. And so I would say as companies look to inset and offset carbon emissions and bring biodiversity into supply chains, bring transparency overall to their efforts, we really welcome partnership with Restore specifically. But this isn't really about us, it's about all of that swath of help. So look out there because those groups exist.
Yeah, take the tips, very helpful tips. And Lucas, finally, you always talked about the holistic sourcing decisions. So what do you recommend them to do?
Yeah, so what can I add to all the good things mentioned? I think what I would like to ask all the buyers is think about your category and think about what actually affects your decision and what could it make more sustainable, and then try to incorporate that in your bidding sheets, because that's an easy way to collect more data. And in the end, if you're not sure what actually affects it, Thomas just mentioned there are 3,800 sustainability ambassadors, which definitely help you. And I'm sure there's hundreds per categories, or NGOs like Clara mentioned. And one of our goals is also to publish some bidding sheets to show you how it is, because in the end, it's also not rocket science, right? It's just, you have to start and you have to do it. And I think just do it. and start with it.
Yeah, so I heard from Fabian, we have many questions. Happy to hear that. So I will hand over to Fabian. And if we are not able to answer all questions, you will get feedback later on. So we will answer all your questions, if now or later on. So Fabian, up to you.
Perfect, thank you very much. And I start out with a question for Thomas, because it's the question that I asked him when we prepared for this. Procurement is still a lot about cost, and somebody has asked us, how do you now manage this? How do you balance this kind of problem of being cost focused on the one hand side, yet trying to be more sustainable? What is your advice to people there?
Of course, it is also about cost. It's bread and butter for procurement, but thankfully we have we've gotten wiser, and we know that there's so many other dimensions that we need to consider. And I think what Stefan mentioned is that there is a direct correlation between sustainability and resiliency. So we saw that with COVID. I mean, the companies that were cost only, they were the ones who had the biggest disruptions in their supply chains during COVID. We have treated our suppliers as partners for 20 years plus. We have no factory that has shut down. All the seeds are going in the ground. The medicine is going to people in need. So there is a resilience dimension, and you cannot ignore that. There is access to innovation. There is so much more that we need to do. The equity of companies, depend on whether you are making sustainable choices. So I do think, as Lucas was saying, when you make your decision matrices, you have to make sure that you only invite partners that represent the values that you want to have, and that should be defined in your category strategy, where hopefully you have clarity of who do you talk to and who do you absolutely not talk to. Right? So nobody should come unless they sort of meet the minimum criteria. And then in your decision, what's the role of sustainability in this particular category? And as Stefan is saying, some categories is not particularly relevant. Others, CO2 is very, very relevant. So, know your category, make sure it's baked into your decision matrix. If you do not have an internal cost for CO2, start talking about it. What's your internal cost that you can even mathematically start putting it into your algorithms? All those practices exist. So again, do it. Make sure that it's reflected in your decision. And then very few, responsible leaders will question your decision. You will find maybe some leaders who are not so responsible. My advice to you is, get out of there as quickly. Find companies who want to appreciate your responsible behavior. That would be my advice. Find leaders that you want to work for. If they don't get it, find somebody else.
Thank you. I think that picked up on a couple of points that Lucas made earlier as well. So very good. Eric asked a question, Clara, that I think might be interesting for you. We often talk about sustainability teams and then procurement teams. And even if a sustainability team is part of the procurement function, how do you feel about that? And how can we make that one team because it's under one procurement?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I've seen a number of companies do it in a number of ways. I think the simplest thing to do is have responsible or sustainable procurement, whatever you want to call it, as one entity. And perhaps you have sustainability professionals who feed data in that help advise that. But as long as they are separate, it is impossible to be able to make decisions that are coordinated in that way. So there are many aspects of sustainability for a company. There are ways in which, companies are working on what's happening within their office buildings. Maybe that's managed by sustainability. But when you think about procurement, it needs to sit under that single umbrella.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that perspective. That's I think that's really interesting to see, because I remember when I was working in my last company, that was exactly the kind of topic. So it was not yet one umbrella, and so therefore it's way to go for everybody still, probably.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about who has the money and who has the relationships, right? And it's not sustainability most of the time.
Well, but they're becoming more powerful, so that's good. So Slav has asked a question for Stefan. He's pointing out that we're a little bit in a chicken or egg situation here, and so he's asking, is it the financial performance framework that should come first, and sustainability second, or should sustainability be in the lead and then financial performance should follow? What's your take on that?
Well, for me, the financial performance is the outcome what I do. So I need to do good on the sustainability side, in our case, sustainable sourcing, sustainable supplier, resilience, what Thomas said, and the outcome is the financial performance. The only question that might kind of include it in this, which we also have in other areas, do we need a strategic budget? That often comes, do we need a budget for sustainability that we invest in projects so that we can make progress? I would say, yes, similar as for digitalization, similar as for supplier innovation. If I want to set up these initiatives, I need some money. I need a sponsor. That also goes back to what Thomas said. Top management needs to say, yes, that's an issue, and we need to somehow build a team, build a department, build a group, and the results come later. And let's just see this in the financial performance later on.
I think having worked for Unilever, that's exactly the take that they had. Let's be sustainable first, and the results will follow. So I wholeheartedly agree with that. So Tanja, I think we're unfortunately out of time. There have been a couple of more questions that we will try to answer afterwards. But I think for closing remarks, I hand it back to you.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for that great session. Very, very helpful insights, and I really appreciate it. And I think the audience as well, because there are many questions. If you want to read the research results, please go to the website, read it. I really encourage you to do that. Also, join the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. It's super helpful, as everyone said here, get connected with other people. And yes, I thank you for your time, for your interest. And the only last word I can say, have a great weekend.
Thank you, Tanja.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.